welcome to the panel. I'm not going to go into introductions any longer, and we'll just jump right in. Okay, I'll start with you, Ali, first. So you have been with Google DeepMind since 2015, and now you lead research strategy at Gemini. And now, can you tell us a little bit about the early days about AI? Because, of course, pretty much here, everyone here knows what is happening now. But what was it like in the early days when nobody was noticing what you guys were doing? And did you kind of see where this was headed?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I actually did my undergrad degree in AI starting way back in 2005, almost exactly 20 years, well, more than 20 years ago. And back then, I remember most conversations I would have, people would say, you know, what do you study? I would say artificial intelligence. They would say, what is that? And then you would kind of start explaining what that is. And I never expected to have a career in AI. I thought it was a bit like studying, I don't know, teleportation or nuclear fusion or something that just felt completely like sci-fi. So it was like just a fun intellectual exercise that we were beginning to do. And then I did a PhD in machine learning, and machine learning was a slightly more kind of grown-up way of talking about AI. It felt less sci-fi, and it had like more statistical grounding. And again, it was a community of maybe, I would say, about 500 to 1,000 people across the world that were interested in this topic. We'd go to conferences a lot like this, and the big rooms would have been just as big as this one, where people would have shown their recent results. And when I started at DeepMind in 2015, even back then, DeepMind was a group of about 100 people. When I joined, the website was just a black page with a logo. There was nothing you could see publicly about what the company does or who it's made of. And yet there was a lot of interest. I wouldn't say quite excitement, because it didn't really feel like anything was working. It was, decades, literally generations of people trying to get this AI thing off the ground and making very little progress. And it all really started changing just around that time, 2013, 14, with deep learning becoming a thing, and with image classification, image recognition getting off the ground. And then the journey since then has been like riding a rocket ship. It's just problem after problem is being we're making advances on. And a huge moment was ChatGPT in 2022, when the public really got a feel for what this technology is about. And that's when you would go to dinner parties, and people who weren't even in technology would ask you, okay, what is this AI thing? Now I know what you're talking about, or what you've been working on this whole time. And yeah, it's really amazing to see all the interest in it. But it also comes with a downside, which is this, people who aren't from the field are now very much involved in the field. And so there's a lot of work to do on communication and kind of dispelling myths and misunderstandings, which I think we'll get to later in the panel as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. We will get to that. And before I turn to Marcus, I have one more question for you. And this is for the audience. Can you just explain to everyone what is the difference between artificial intelligence and machine learning? Just some basic concepts so that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, sure. So I'll do this briefly. So there's computer science, which is the science of making computers do the things we want them to do. Like booking flights, doing mathematics, writing text documents, that kind of stuff. And artificial intelligence, especially when I started, was really the topic of trying to understand why is it that there's some things that we humans can do and animals can do, but we can't get computers to do those things. Like, how is it that I can walk and I can talk and we have language and I can drive a car and all of those things, but even despite decades of work, we couldn't get computers to do those things. So AI was the scientific study of that question. What is intelligence? What is the thing that makes our brains work, and how can we get computers to do those things? Machine learning is a collection of techniques that has proven to be an incredibly effective way of building artificial intelligence systems. So machine learning comes from statistics. There's a lot of mathematics and statistics. And it's the idea that in order to get computers to behave intelligently, it might be a good idea to get them to learn from experience, either from human experience or from their own experience. And this might sound really natural to us now, but 20 years ago, this was controversial. The controversy was that, why would a machine have to go through all that trial and error to get to that intelligence? Why would it have to mimic how humans do things to get to that intelligence? There must be a grounds up way of achieving the same thing. But I would say in the past 10 years, people have reached an agreement scientifically that machine learning is probably one of the most promising ways of achieving artificial intelligence. And just to kind of end, I would say that it looks very unlikely that we will ever have AI that does not incorporate machine learning of some kind. So I think it's safe to say that it's here to stay.
Understood. So Marcus, you have been, of course, observing and watching the evolution of artificial intelligence well before the ChatGPT moment. You've written about the AlphaGo match. Can you tell the audience about that moment and what it meant?
Yeah, for me, this was a real phase change moment. I mean, we've been talking about artificial intelligence, for like 50 years, but 40 of those, we called AI winters. But basically, there was so much hope, but nothing kind of happening. And it's interesting that machine learning has been around as an idea for a long time. It's not just this current decade, the idea of code learning and adapting. But I think in the past, the way of trying to achieve AI, as you said, was very much top-down approach. Humans would write lines of code, and then the computer would implement it at speed and at depth that we couldn't achieve. And that's why we saw, that was how computers played chess at a very high level. It was really humans very much in control, but the machine just kind of dumbly doing things deeper and at speed so that it could challenge Garry Kasparov and beat him. But Go has a very different quality. This game from China, very much played in Korea and Japan, is very much more visual game. It's a lot about pattern recognition. And as you said, vision was the one thing that AI was having real difficulty with. If you give it a picture in the past, it would try and top-down understand what was in the picture. It was very hard to write instructions to do that. It would analyze things pixel by pixel and make no sense of the general picture, which the human brain is very good at, just immediately looking at something, excluding what's unimportant, focusing on the important. And this top-down approach didn't do that. But the machine learning, as you said, is kind of a bottom-up approach where you have initial code, but as the code interacts with data, and I think this was the key change. We had this kind of Ferrari sitting there of machine learning, but no fuel to make it go. But then suddenly, with the huge amount of digital data that's available, that was the fuel to power this machine. So with that data, it could start to learn, adapt, and change. And I think this is kind of the exciting and slightly frightening thing about this technology, is that as it interacts with data, it adds more and more lines of code. Essentially, when it gets things wrong, I think this is a really important educational message, that machine learning improves when it fails to get something right. So if it's trying to identify pictures of cats and dogs, if it identifies a cat and it's told, no, that is a dog, it'll realize it needs to change and rebalance the parameters in the code to get that right the next time. So I think that's a good message in education. We want everybody to get everything right first go, but we learn best when we get things wrong. And that's sort of the principle behind machine learning. So this game of Go was very visual and hard to kind of write instructions. If you ask a Go player, well, why are you placing a stone down there? So it's black and white stones, and essentially you're trying to capture more territory than your opponent. But machine learning turned out to be the key to training a code to play this. And DeepMind developed this. It was really their coup, the great breakthrough that showed that you could make code do things that it couldn't do in the past. And so they developed this code they gave it lots of human games to understand and learn and adapt. It ran out of human games and started making synthetic games. Essentially, it played itself, and the better version was the one that kind of updated. And it reached a level that DeepMind felt, I think this is at a level that we can challenge the world's best. It was Lee Sedol. Lee Sedol had never ever seen any code getting anywhere near to the way that he played. And so he was completely dismissive. He said, I'm going to be able to beat this thing, actually, hands down. So they played 5 games in a match, 2015, I think it was. Lee Sedol lost 4 games to 1. And he now regards the one game he did win as the greatest win of his whole career. I mean, he was totally shocked at the level this code could play. But for me, I think actually playing Go is very similar to doing mathematics. It requires a lot of intuition, creativity, which actually I'll talk about tomorrow if people are around on Monday. I'm doing a session about my book about mathematics and creativity. But again, it's quite hard to articulate how you do mathematics. So when these matches were going on, I watched them obsessively on YouTube, realizing that if AI could play Go, it's probably going to be able to do mathematics as well. So, but I think the most exciting moment for me was got used to computers playing games at a high level. But something happened in the second game of that match, which I realized this is a phase change, and actually took me on a journey to write the book that I did about creativity in AI. Because we've traditionally felt that creativity is the one thing that AI surely couldn't get anywhere near, because that's about being human. It's an expression of our humanity. But I saw a moment where AI played a move in that game, move 37 of game 2. It's now kind of iconic move, which when I was watching it, I remember the commentators gasping at what a bad move they thought AlphaGo had made. But it turned out that this move was the one that won Go that match. And for me, if I give a definition of creativity, this is a definition by Margaret Bowden. She said that you should regard something as creative if it's new, surprising, and has value. That was a new sort of move. It was surprising because it engaged the emotions of all the commentators. They thought, what a terrible move. But it had value, and you can judge value quite cleanly in a game. Does it win or lose you the game? So for me, I felt that was a real creative act. And it was a creative act of the code and not the humans, because it was a learning process of the code. A human hadn't written that line of code. Indeed, I think if a human had seen that line in the code,
they might have deleted it.
They would have deleted it. So, your Go master would have slapped your wrist if you'd made it's a move very deep into the board early on, which Go masters say, do not make that sort of move. It's a very weak move. And it's transformed the way we play the game. So there have been 3 revolutions in the game of Go. One in the 16th century, one at the beginning of the 20th, and now the 21st century, initiated by Go. And I feel that this is the exciting opportunities, that it can help humans to do things in new ways, show us new ways to do things. The book I wrote, The Creativity Code, is a very positive book about how we shouldn't be. This is not a competitor, it's an amazing collaborator.
Thank you so much for that. And you just touched upon, how it's exciting, but it's also frightening. And that's where I'm going to come to you, PTR, is because you are, of course, a politician who's having to govern through one of the biggest transformations in human history. And how are you thinking about this transformation? How are you talking about it to your bureaucrats, policymakers, your constituents?
Yeah, I think, bureaucrats and constituents are probably not quite up to speed about the potential yet, and that's a bit of a scary problem as well. But in my experience from the markets, it's very difficult for regulators to get ahead of innovation. Innovation will far exceed regulators, right? You can play catch up if you're smart and you have the right people, and iteratively you can come up to the right level. But in this case, I think there's broader implications, right? There's a lot of resources that go into it. Is that going to be equitably accessible? Are we still a democracy? Everybody has access to the same tools, or only some people have over time. I mean, right now, a lot of it is free and a lot of it is accessible to everybody. Second, there's the old adage that the victors get to write history. Whoever codes these and puts the data in gets to define how these models learn and what they actually execute, right? It's straightforward if it's a game, but if it's something more kind of problematic or complicated or diverse than that. It matters a lot about the data going in and the kind of guardrails that are put in to avoid biases in the system or to have a skew. And I think at the last resource, which is the amount of energy, the specialized chips, the access to kind of water and all the other things that are required, we don't want this to create another kind of exacerbating factor in the haves and the have-nots. I think these are the three main areas from a regulatory standpoint. From a policy standpoint, I think it is an opportunity for us to rethink the notion of education and learning. Right? I used to be an industrial consultant many years ago, and what I saw happen to factories over 20 or 25 years is probably going to happen to low-end white-collar work, actually middle-end white-collar work. And so what is it that we're teaching our children, particularly when we go for universal education like Tamil Nadu is very unique. Gross enrollment ratio in tertiary education is above 50%. All our children graduate high school. But we have made it a commoditized path to a job and an actual function, right? We export like probably 30% of the Bay Area's coders come from Tamil Nadu. Now, what are we going to do about that? Because those jobs are not going to be around for a long time. So we need to rethink the notion of education. And even taking Marcus's point that machines can be creative, I still think we need to go back to what does it mean to be a human being? And what does it mean to be not just sentient, but a good communicator, a good interaction with other human beings, social skills. These kinds of things, I think, need to be given more emphasis. And, of course, deeply thoughtful kind of education, which in the rush to mass education, I think we have commoditized it to get a degree, get a job, get paid. That we need to rethink all the way. We've started to do some of it at the kind of college graduate, even the middle school level with people like Google and Microsoft. And we are trying to equip the latest graduates. We've just started a program where Perplexity has given us their app for free. And Copilot has been installed on these for free, and we give it to all the students who are graduating college, like every student graduating college from this year on. But that's like retrofit, right? Now, middle school, we started to kind of rethink the education. We probably need to go back to elementary education and start thinking, more profoundly about that. And then the implications for training of teachers. So I think these are the things at the top of my mind.
Thank you. And you've just touched upon a point which I'm going to now take to Ali, which is about communication. So this is how you're talking to your circle around this. But I'm very interested in I'll combine two questions into one. One is, what should we, the public, know about what's coming from the frontier of research? Not what we've read about in the newspapers, but in your position, you sort of have a crystal ball, not a crystal ball, but you can see a little bit further than the rest of us. So tell us what we need to know in terms of what's coming. And the second question, which I'll combine into this one, is how do you think Frontier Labs can communicate better with the public outside of the Twitter bubble about what's actually happening in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so the one interesting aspect of this technology, as Marcus spoke about, is the kind of surprise factor, which often happens. So yeah, I was actually at DeepMind in our offices in London when that move was played. It was like 3 or 4 a.m. We were in the office kind of watching the games, and everybody was surprised. Like, there was genuine shock when that move was made, and we had experts who said it was a terrible move, and then later we found it was a good move. But this happens all the time. The models that we train, when they come out of the oven, we have to kind of scientifically test them to understand what they're good at and what they're bad at, and communicate that both internally and externally. So I co-lead the prototyping team of Gemini, and our job literally is to take these new AIs, to test them, and then to help our own company understand what they should be doing with it, but also to explain to the outer world why they should care about this new AI that was generated. Like, what's new about Gemini 3, for instance, or what's new about our new image model, and so on. So that understanding and kind of communication itself is a process that is relatively new and needs a science around it to be developed. The other thing I want to mention is like there's a rapidly increasing pace of advancement in this field, which is, I'm sure it's not unique. I'm sure we've had this kind of pace of development before, perhaps in the Industrial Revolution or in, say, aerospace and so on. But things are moving really fast, and it's actually an extremely competitive environment. And so one thing people are often surprised by is that the frontier labs, what we know or what we see internally is often only a few weeks ahead of what people outside know or see. Because sitting on that research for more than a few weeks often means that you're not in the lead anymore. So we have huge incentives to kind of publish and talk about the things that we see as soon as we can. So internal and outside knowledge of this technology is kind of actually quite similar. But what I would add also is that when something is moving, the best way to understand where it's going is to understand where it's coming from, right? That gives you the velocity vector, and you can kind of make extrapolation. So I would actually say that one of the best ways to understand where we are with AI is to study its history. You don't have to study its history that deeply, but looking at what we were talking about in AI science circles 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago is so useful in understanding why the AlphaGo moment was important, or understanding what was new about ChatGPT. And it's very difficult to communicate that without that history. It's also useful to study history, I think, to make predictions about how things will happen in the future, how society will react, how policy needs to be made. Because in a sense, society's gone through similar revolutions before. There's always something new about a new technological revolution, but there's also things that repeat. We've had the Industrial Revolution, we've had the Internet Revolution, the Digital Revolution, and so on. And I think looking at those things gives us a better sense of what's happening in the future. Now, final thing I'll say is actually exactly around the time of AlphaGo, I remember speaking with our CEO, Demis, and I was arguing that there's a rich history of physics and mathematics communication, at least in the UK. We've had people like Marcus and others who do a fantastic job of communicating to the broader public what is going on in, say, the astronomy community or in the physics community, but also why that scientific research exists. What is the itch that we're scratching by looking into the stars or looking into atoms and so on? And I've argued for a long time that that's been missing with AI. In the press, we often talk about the next model that's come out and the good things and the bad things that people are doing with that. But in my opinion, we don't spend nearly enough time talking about why this field exists in the first place. What is it about our brains that is so fascinating to us? What is it about intelligence that is so remarkable? In a previous panel, I was saying that it's because of our brains and our intelligence that we have arts and we have culture and we have language and we have music and dance, and we can sit together and spend time talking to each other. Other animals, other beings don't do this as far as I know, right? So there's something deeply curious and fascinating about that, and I think there's so much we can do to communicate that to our younger generations, but also everybody.
Thank you. And I really like what you said about, for example, the Industrial Revolution. And what strikes me, and I'm going to come to Marcus with the next question around that, is, of course, the biggest thing we saw in the Industrial Revolution is that manual labor became very cheap. And what we are seeing is happening now with cognitive labor. So just in the same way that manual labor became cheap after the Industrial Revolution, with the AI revolution, you're going to see a situation where cognitive labor becomes available to everybody, and universities, of course, are in the business of producing people to get jobs with their cognitive labor. So how would you prepare students for what is coming?
I think we have to remember this is a tool, an amazing new tool, and we've got quite used as a society to adapting and bringing tools in and changing. I mean, I think the difference between the Industrial Revolution and this revolution is the speed. The Industrial Revolution affected the generation that was coming. This is affecting us, in lifetime. So everyone together, and 10 years' time, we're going to have to be doing things in a very different way. So I think one of the mistakes education makes is that we're trying to teach them how to do things, or teaching them facts or something like this. I think that we need to change this and teach people how to learn, because we're continually going to have to learn new things as we go forward. Each decade, it's going to be a very different kind of landscape. So education should be not about learning facts, but learning how to learn, is my feeling. I think the idea of using history is a really good way to understand, where we are going to, understanding where we've come from. And, my job is in the public understanding of science. So it's my mission to try and engage the society with these new technologies as they appear. And, the book I wrote about the creativity code, one of the things I feel that the mistakes we make is just regarding this as a black box, and that we can't understand what it's doing. But I think we can really understand. So in my book, I really tried to lift up the bonnet and show you how this engine worked, because that kind of knowledge gives you control and an understanding of what the thing can do and what it can't do. My great fear is that as people are using large language models, they think this thing is delivering truth, because it feels very like a Google search. And Google is, the Google search engines would take you somewhere that was written by a human. Still, you've got to question whether the human is telling you the truth. But if you understand how a large language model works, you realize it's based on statistics. What's the most likely things that will follow the text that I've seen at the moment? And I think we really have to teach our undergraduates, society, to question everything that's coming out of the large language models, because they're very likely, 50% of it could well be leading you astray. So I think it's having that knowledge of how the thing works will allow you to assess, should I trust what I've just read that's come out of this kind of search using the large language models? I often feel, we've got a lot of authors here who are very terrified of this. There's a wonderful Roald Dahl story of the Tales of the Unexpected. I think it's called The Great Grammaticizer or something like that. But it's about somebody who comes up, it's quite old, it's like decades old, but Roald Dahl had this, this fear that we would make a machine that could learn the style of an author and then suddenly replace them, because it could write novels very quickly. And so, we've been worried about the idea that our novelist is going to get put out of a job. And I think this fear is unjustified. And if people understood how the large language models worked, they would not be terrified. So I think that I often feel like people who are criticizing AI, it's a bit like we have a big immigration debate in England, and the people who are terrified of immigrants are the ones who've never met an immigrant. I've lived in London, and I know how rich our society is because of the immigration that arrives. And so my feeling is those who are terrified of AI either haven't used it or don't understand it, and they're therefore blanket saying, no, I don't want any of this. And I think it's that key, is the access to understanding what this thing is, how it is a tool that can transform and help us to be more creative as human beings.
Thank you. And of course, I'm going to be a little quick now to leave enough time for audience questions. But PTR, of course, all of this has an economic cost. And I'm going to talk to you about that, because in India, of course, we have some form of a welfare state where we have seen direct cash transfers to people who are in need. And usually this is something reserved for people who we consider as in the area of poverty. But of course, with AI, we are seeing a very serious discussion in economics around UBI, or universal basic income. Now, do you see a situation, given all the political costs of looking at UBI for people who are traditionally considered educated and wealthy by Indian standards, can you ever see something like that happening in India?
That's a dangerous question. So,
sorry.
No, why don't I just pick up on where Marcus left off for a second first? I think that the nature of work is changing and is going to continue to change dramatically. But I don't see it disappearing in such large volumes that I'm worried about mass unemployment, actually, if you ask me. Our socio-political construct requires we have human beings do things that are then justiciable, that are legally kind of actionable. We would very much want a judge, we want a doctor, we don't want these things, even the best model, if it can do better than a human being. So I think Actually, because of the ethical issues, because of first, in today's age, the amount of massive tagging and deconstructing of things that are going into actually training these engines. There's a lot of new kinds of jobs appearing, all the way from mundane, low-level jobs to very sophisticated jobs, right? This notion that radiologists would disappear, Jeff Hinton, is actually completely reversed. Now there's like much more sophisticated radiologists required to validate that the model actually gave something that the human being can go and get their lung cut out, for example, right? That we're not going to leave to a machine. So I think the nature of work will change dramatically. It may result in significant unemployment in certain sectors. It may bring out other jobs. But I would not tie the notion of UBI just to this development. I would say this notion of, over time in a good society, should we be doing means-tested or targeted funding, or should we be doing all funding? Now, most political philosophies would say, at least for states like ours or most Indian states, we don't really have the resources to do universal income. You know, it's not in the realm. And there's this whole question about equity versus equality when you do things. And you know, when I was finance minister, after 20, 25 years, we raised the property taxes and the electricity rates and all that because they'd simply not adjusted inflation. But when we raised them hugely progressively, like the poor stayed low, and then the rich, like, you know, my bills went up like 80% or something. And then we indexed them to inflation so that we wouldn't have to do this political debate every year, and there was no courage to keep raising. So at some point, I think you have to have a progressive taxation model, and you have to have a thoughtful distribution model, at least till you get to be like a resource-rich surplus state that is always running budget surpluses, and the wealth is coming out of the ground in coal or oil or gold or lithium or whatever the next source of wealth needs to be. The flip side is that when you try to do these kinds of less than universal payments, it's very hard to get it right. A mutual friend of ours, Esther Duflo, who worked with me in Tamil Nadu when we were doing the model, it's very, very difficult to know where to reduce both type 1 and type 2 errors if you're trying to target the people at the bottom of the pyramid. We've implemented something. It's better than nothing. I would say it's still got room to improve. And so at some point, you will need to get to the notion of universal. And we already do some things, like public goods and services, which we, most states give for free, is universal anyway, though access may vary. Like one of the great things we have is a good healthcare system. And better than most advanced countries, we have fantastically good public health systems with, all the way to complex surgeries done for free in the government hospitals without that much wait. There's other kind of minor irritants like, rent seeking at the attendant level, but the overall system is good. So I see this as a progression. I don't see that this is the flip switch that we go from not needing it to needing it.
Understood. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a last question to all of you because we don't have that much time. And then I'll open it up to the audience. So we only have 2 minutes to answer this question, and it's the biggest question of all, which is about sentience and consciousness in AI. So I'm not going to, thankfully for you all, I won't be giving you a lot of time to answer it. So start with you, Ali. Do research labs, how do they think about emerging consciousness, sentience, the question of it altogether? I mean this in a scientific way. How do you observe this in a lab?
So what I know is, the lab that I work at at DeepMind is about, let's say, about 1,000 scientists like myself. I know there's a small number of people whose research is specifically on this, maybe on the order of like 3-4 people. So they think about this topic a lot. I would say on the whole, I've not seen many people who think that we're close to that. So it's not a topic of conversation that I encounter frequently. When you see how these things are built, in my opinion, you realize that it feels quite far from consciousness and sentience. So it's not discussed that much, I would say, at least not at DeepMind.
Thank you.
Although you had a Google employee who thought that his large language model had become conscious and was prepared to defend it so much that he lost his job. So it was almost like the large language model had taken over like a virus or something, and he sacrificed himself. So I think it is an issue which is popping up, and I agree. I think it's a long time before we'll see this happen, but I do think there will be another phase change. I don't see why not. I don't think there's any kind of magic.
If the history is anything to go by.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think, you know what? I think that it's places like JLF, which will be the important places where we'll realize that that phase change has happened. Because, as you said, our creativity is our way of understanding each other's consciousness. I mean, the hard problem of consciousness is one of the greatest, you know. How do I know that you're not all zombies or avatars and you're still in bed at home? Some of you are looking still a bit zombified on a Sunday morning.
It's very early.
But you know, we use our stories to actually activate our own consciousness, examine it, to share what pain means for me, what ecstasy does. And it's our stories which actually I think are creativity is our greatest tool to actually kind of solve that idea of, are you conscious? Is your consciousness anything like my consciousness? So I think, you know, we've already seen large language models writing stories and things, but I think it's the story that will tell us when a phase change has happened. Because if there is suddenly consciousness, that kind of AI consciousness will be desperate to tell us what it feels like.
It's going to be just like us. It's going to let us know it's here.
It's going to let us know. But, you know, as Wittgenstein said, if a lion could speak, we won't be able to understand it. And I think the point is that AI consciousness will be very different from human consciousness. I actually think AI should not be translated as artificial intelligence. That was Turing trying to understand the human brain. It's a very different sort of intelligence already. I think we should call it augmented or alternative or additional intelligence. It's something very different, and we should celebrate that because it's the radiologist human together with the AI goes much further than each one individually.
And there's such a long history of externalizing our intelligence, which is from the calculator, the abacus, you know. Final question to you, and I promised him there'll be at least one question in which I won't refer to him as a politician. So, as a human being, what do you think about this question? At least I got a laugh out of the audience.
No, you know, I'm not as worried also. I'm in the same camp. I think like it would be a long time before I worry whether I'm interacting with a human or not, at least in real life. But I must say, and partly as a politician, partly as a victim of this, the level of AI-generated videos and audios of actual live politicians has completely, like, you know, it's gone to a different stratosphere in the last 2 years. So now you see a video, you cannot say whether it's genuine or not. It's completely automated. And that, it's interesting because we're going to go into an election campaign in a couple of months. And it's going to be scary, this election campaign. Because for the first time, it was not true in 24, but it's true now. I can see these videos and you can't tell which is actual human being and which is completely generated by the machine. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's give our panelists a big hand. And there's so many questions. Thank you to all of you. Okay, so one very quick rule. There's lots of hands. Very, very brief questions, please, and no long rambling thoughts. Just very pointed questions, make it count. There's the lady over there who jumped up and made it count here. Very brief, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the engaging session. And please forgive me if my question sounds innocent or stupid.
We can't hear you clearly.
Okay, I'm saying thank you for the session, and please forgive me if my question sounds a little innocent or stupid. I just need to know what happens exactly neurally when the moment like AlphaGo happens, when you understand that machine is, the result is not just another outcome in a series of accumulated, patterns. What exactly happens neurotically? I'm very curious about it in a machine.
Yeah,
that you count it as intelligence. I mean, what exactly happens if it...
So the way I would answer that question is that actually there's a lot of testing that happens as these systems are developed. So over months and years, you have scientists who work with the system and test it over and over and over again in thousands and thousands of different scenarios. And we try to measure improvement along one metric. So for instance, how often does it beat an average player? Or how often does it beat an older version of itself? We track that. And then when a match is happening for real, or when a system is deployed in the real world, those systems are monitored both by the developers of the system and by users of the system. And then humans kind of analyze behaviors and try to spot patterns in those behaviors. And that move 37 was a particular moment that humans noticed to be a particularly creative or intelligent moment in the behavior of the system. And collectively as humans, we've decided to make that a mark and to consider that to be an important moment or a creative moment. The same thing happens over and over again in every domain, whether it's image recognition or language and so on. So it's actually, it is surprising, but we're monitoring it. Like there's a scientific process that discovers those things. It doesn't happen in a way that we don't expect. We hope that this happens and we see it and then we celebrate it.
We're going to very quickly, let's just take all the questions together to save time. Yeah. Can you give your question, sure. Then the gentleman in the orange jacket, and there's a young person here, we must hear from a young person.
My question is for PTR. If we look at the previous cycles of tech innovation in the last 50 years, healthcare, biotech, defense, it was primarily led by the public sector, the public universities and labs, and then the private sector came in. But this cycle seems to be different, where the private labs are leading the charge. So as a policymaker, what do you think are the implications given that private sector is motivated by profits? So what's your take on that?
Very quickly, can you tell us your question?
Yeah, you've been talking about training data, which is for benign purposes, like astronomical data for detecting black holes or amino acid chains for protein folds. What about, I write science fiction, what about a malign intent? So you're actually looking at footage of drones detecting where to kill people in Ukraine or Russia, or the kind of thing that Cambridge Analytics has been doing, where you're trying to train artificial intelligence being used to sort of incite hatred. What, as policy people or scientists, what do you do about this, and how do we stop it?
Thank you. And finally, since you are the future, all the pressures on you, go for it.
So my question is AI is the new digital drug for children?
Is it a digital drug for children? All right, let's go ahead and answer the questions. Who would like to take the first one? You're using your admin privileges. Yeah. Okay, let's answer the questions first.
Yeah, I'll take the funding one. Look, I think in the end, the innovation is done by human beings. The funding sometimes comes from the government. The government in itself doesn't actually do much of the innovation. If you look at the internet and the email and all that, it was DARPA funded, but it came out of universities. Sometimes states have more kind of managed budgets, and now almost all states are in deep kind of recession. And the markets have become so big, particularly with the excess liquidity around. So it's a profound change. We have never seen hundreds of billions of dollars of private, because without knowing what the outcome was, there was no market funding for it, right? There wasn't that kind of risk appetite. We live in possibly a bubble, but in a different way. But at the end of the day, the market will get the equitable outcome. I'm not worried that the governments own it or don't own it. Even if they did, they have to give it away at some point. The GPS is accessible to everybody, the internet is accessible to everybody. But you're right, it's been a profound change in who has the money and where's the liquidity coming from. And this is probably the first cycle where all this excess liquidity in the markets is driving a lot of the funding.
Thank you. And the second question, I'm afraid I could not hear it very well.
I think,
you want to take that?
I can try and repeat it. So I think the question was, what about military applications and kind of lethal applications, and how do we deal with that, and how do we stop it? So in my opinion, these technologies are kind of what some people call dual-use technologies. They can be used for good and for bad. It's the nature of the topic that we're dealing with, which is intelligence. And you know, personally, speaking just for myself, I'm very much against the use of these technologies for lethal or military applications. I know many of my colleagues at Google are. In my mind, it becomes a social conversation that we need to have. It often involves policymakers and politics and forums like this, so that we collectively arrive at policies that make sense for society. You know, looking back at history again, you know, technologies like electricity or the internet have also had this nature where, you know, it can be used to power a hospital, or it could be used to create, you know, weapons that do very nasty things. So I think individually and as societies, we work together and we try to find paths forward that make sense. That would be my approach.
Thank you so much. Final question Marcus is going to answer because he's done a lot of science communication for children.
Yes, I mean, I think, social media we're very worried about with children, and I think it's because, social media companies have understood how addiction works, and so they are delivering us material which, we can't stop scrolling. The infinite scroll is probably, whoever invented the infinite scroll needs to spend a long time in hell, I think, because, but actually I would say artificial intelligence is different, because I actually think there's something much more exciting about empowering youth to do interesting things. So yeah, could we actually?
There's a lot of noise coming from the
here.
green room. We're going to shame you now.
I can't hear what I'm saying because of that. I think that it's a real opportunity. I think it's a democratizer, and it's allowing people to play in a way that before you had to go and be trained to be a painter, be trained to be a musician. And I think although a lot of middle tier jobs are going to go, I think we actually see the opportunity of new people being able to come into the industry, learning how to use large language models to stimulate their writing or to create music. So I feel actually AI is a much more positive tool to get obsessed with than social media, for example.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much. Photo finish. Thank you to my panelists for such a lovely discussion and to the audience for listening to us.